Hello.
Hello.
I'm Alex.
I'm Val.
And we're very excited to be here talking about Pine Barrens.
We sounded really excited when we started this podcast.
We said hello?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's pretty exciting.
Pretty exciting.
I mean, I've just been waiting so long to get here. And now that it's here, it's overwhelming.
Yes.
Overwhelmed by the episode.
There's very few episodes that I'm like excited about doing, and this is one of them. It's a lot of pressure. So, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think anything has been written about more than this.
Yeah.
Or talked about. I mean, just in general, I feel like this is like one of the most recognized episodes of this entire series.
Totally. At this point, just to take a little bit of the pressure off of me, I'm going to say that as a reminder that this podcast, we watch an episode and then just come and record this directly after.
That's right.
So we're not researching, we're not planning on what we say. So I hope we can communicate this in a coherent
I mean, there's just
fashion.
so much happening
There's so much
in this episode, and it's slightly more difficult maybe than some others to really get like under the surface of what is really being communicated. But I mean, on the whole, I mean, like with all of our episodes, you know, we're gonna, you know, try and just kind of decode it as best as we can.
Yeah. And I think actually in this episode, maybe more than some others, there are kind of these overarching, to call it symbols would be too simplistic, but these kind of overarching ideas that go through all the different storylines that are happening within an episode.
I agree.
So I don't know if we want to maybe start with those, and then we can go into. I think that's kind of what this episode is about.
What are some of the themes that you see that are extending to all the different storylines?
Well, I think we definitely have a theme of like whiteness and like light and dark.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Which again, I'm struggling to unpack in the moment.
Yeah.
I think this is not really a symbol, but I think we have some really strange passage of time.
Yeah.
In this episode, and I think that holds some meaning for this kind of like surrealist world that is created.
And yet, I feel like there's almost like a dichotomy or something. Like there's like strange passage of time, but also very literal passage of time.
Well, that's the thing, but then there's things that like clue us into what time it is.
Yeah, and we're also given specifically times,
totally.
like 9 p.m. dinner, we see the clock just before 9 p.m. to show that there's a conflict there. There's all sorts of things that are hyper-literal.
Sorry to wake you up so late.
Yeah.
Chris and Polly asking what time it is. Anyways, I don't want to get into it
now. Yeah, but I mean, I
but
feel like in this episode, there's kind of like two domains that are established. There's the world of Pine Barrens and the kind of like hyper-realistic world that exists around the Sopranos. And I think that is almost kind of part of the point, and that the passage of time and the way that it works in those two places does reflect what those places are. Because I think Pine Barrens is like elevated outside of the real world. And that when they're going back in the end of the episode, for me, there's an element of them reflecting on what it means and like speeding by in the car and seeing all the trees in the background that have been established, not only in this episode very strongly, but in the series on the whole, and especially trees moving with wind, which is something that we've seen in all sorts of episodes, especially like College, which we've talked about, you know, and also I think is kind of like a link to this episode in terms of its structure. But I think these characters are kind of reflecting on what it all meant, because I think Pine Barrens is more than just a place where those two get lost. Like it is elevated, and there's a metaphorical value to it too, which we'll get into. But I feel like as they're driving back, and like the last words that are uttered between that group and to kind of close off that storyline are mayonnaise. You have mayonnaise on your chin. And then Polly kind of gets rid of it, and then they drive back. And even like the composition is, you know, of this like road that's leading in, they're kind of like following it into the perspective that kind of like takes us off out of this realm, but they're going back to this world of time passing in literal ways, of mayonnaise being an issue. It's removed from whatever Pine Barrens is.
That's why I said the time was interesting.
I completely agree. I agree with you. That's a good point. But I didn't actually think of that as like one of the things that connected everything.
I see. Yeah. For me, that's like kind of what I was trying to get at, I guess, when I was saying it. Like there are these like other episodes, like there's other episodes that play with our sense of time also, but this one, like with the the direction of Steve Buscemi, he definitely like has a vibe, and it is these kind of strange cuts sometimes.
Yeah.
It is
camera work too.
camera work. We have a lot, like more than any other episode, I think. We have a lot of jumping back and forth between places. Like we have very short scenes with our characters, and we're kind of jumping around, I think, more than typical. So again, that kind of ties into the feeling of time thing too. And then what was the other one I was thinking of? I don't know. What else are you like in terms
Maybe
of overarching?
communication was a big one.
Well, that
for me.
Yeah.
There was a lot of that, like this idea in the very beginning of the episode, Tony and Carm being in therapy, talking about, like we are communicating better.
Yeah.
The communication between all characters, how it breaks down, the communication over the phones, like literally the broken telephone of the, Chechens to the Czechoslovakians,
Right.
I pronounced that badly. I'm sorry, everyone. Sorry to all our Czech friends.
We can come to that too.
But
I think there definitely is a communication thing.
Because I think that theme of communication applies to all the kind of dyads of characters that we're seeing. We have like Tony and Gloria, we have Tony and Carmela, we have Jackie Jr. and Meadow, we have Polly and Christopher, and communication is kind of at the center of a lot of those things. And ultimately, nobody is really communicating with anybody. And there's almost like false communication that exists. Like, for instance, like when Polly is communicating with Tony and blaming things on Christopher, there's just kind of examples of there's no real kind of like organic or truthful interaction between any of these people.
Right.
And then also it's kind of an interesting one because there's some complexity to how Tony interacts with different characters in terms of his honesty and communication, because there's some instances where he actually kind of makes good in terms of his communication of actually like being honest about something, which kind of complicates the kind of like dimensionality of like how he behaves as a character. Like it's not simple and clear cut. Like with Gloria, for instance, like he says that, he kind of like picks up on the ruse that it's like somebody calling from AJ's school, and then he says, like, no, I'm being honest, even though he's a dick about it, and like he does lie about it at first. It doesn't last long before he actually is honest and actually says what's going on. And
then we have him with Melfi actually like telling Melfi
about Gloria. And even to a lesser degree, I mean, just in terms of like endearing Tony and having some behavior that's actually kind of having some integrity to it. When he's apologizing to Bobby at the end, after like kind of like making fun of him for coming out in this hunting gear and then recognizing that there actually is value to that. There are a few things that he does as a character to communicate with people where he actually does value like the truth or how he actually feels, even though it might be difficult. Even though at the same time, all of these examples start off with him kind of being a dick and abusing people and manipulating things and then kind of rectifying it somewhat. There's still something there where he actually does kind of go out of his way, and it's more multidimensional than it could have been for that character, because most of the time he is just completely disingenuous.
Right. I like the scene at the very beginning when Gloria goes onto the boat and then picks up the phone. First of all, it's like so indicative of her character that she would just like pick up someone else's phone.
Totally.
Right?
Yeah.
And like we've seen other times where like Irina would call, like when Irina called the Soprano house, for example, right? Like that's obviously something that's not ordinary kinds of communication, or shouldn't be, or
right, like
Tony
the communication
like
is not intended for Gloria, and actually for Gloria to step in there is actually like clearly like there's part of her subconscious that like wants danger or to like make things a problem, because for her to pick up his phone is just asking for
if anyone
issues.
did that, even if someone did that to me, I'd be like, what the fuck? Like, I'd be like, why are you picking up my phone? Like it's really weird. But it's also interesting because it puts those two characters together, right? And then like they have some level of communication, which is really strange. Like characters who shouldn't be communicating, or like in normal circumstances wouldn't,
and yet they represent like the same relationship to Tony.
Totally.
And that it's weird to see those two people that are basically just separated through time communicating with each other, and who are those two characters and how are they different?
I think the time aspect, again, like kind of going back to that, is interesting, right? Like it kind of like those two characters don't really exist in the same time for us typically, except that suddenly Irina calls in this moment and is connected to Gloria. I mean, and then that of course ties into like, what Melfi says and what we said last week about like these characters like Irina and Gloria being kind of pseudo Livias, you know. Well, she doesn't say that, but it's implied. So yeah, I just thought that was like a really interesting way to start the episode. And I think in terms of the communication, like there is so much going on there. We even like, we have these characters who are also missing, like, so characters who are sick, who, like Syl, for example, like we don't see Syl in this episode, but he allegedly has the flu, right? And he's the one who kind of like starts off this whole chain of events.
Right.
And so we see how this like chain of command, but also this chain of communication kind of leads to this event that's going on. That like, you know, Paulie gets the phone call while he's getting his nails done.
Right.
And then he and Chris have to go to Valerie's house, right? So I don't know. There's just like these kind of chains. And then I think too with like the broken communication. And we saw that in other episodes too, when like we have this like weird echoing thing happening in the phone, right? Like it almost sounds like there's a woman's voice that's like interfering with the with the
it's almost like it's like
connection. And so again, it's like, you know, who's on this line? What is it that's breaking up the communication? I think that it is meaningful that it is kind of like a female voice. At least I interpret it kind of like a female voice. Sometimes it's an echo back of like Tony's voice. Right. Right. But then sometimes we really get this like weird ghostly female voice going on. I don't know. I think there's something to that, but I can't.
For sure. And like their inability to communicate through technology too is like placing these characters as like unable to interact within this new paradigm kind of. Like the technology does kind of save them. Like I don't know how they would have found each other without it, but at the same time like their communication is like stunted and they are unable to make use of this technology fully to like kind of interact with each other. And there's something to that because I mean the static just keeps on showing up so much.
Well, it's interesting, just kind of as an aside, because you mentioned technology. I was going to mention that as well, because in one of those first scenes, when they first go to Valerie's house, they're like overwhelmed by his stereo system and his universal remote. Right. And he's obviously someone who like knows a lot about technology and has a universal remote, but like has this very advanced system, right? And even like the money is on top of his, he calls it like his stereo system or something like that. And he, of course,
entertainment console,
something like that. He has like a weird terminology for it. But we have him who's able to like survive against all odds, right? Like because he's kind of mastered this domain that they haven't. Right. Technology part of it, but I think there's also like another domain of, I don't know, to do with like his military training, like. To do with him being Russian. I'm not sure what it is. But
for me, I mean, I think that like because, and we'll probably come back to this later, but like the very strong association in this series of trees, nature to death, like I feel like their exploration of Pine Barrens is them being close to death. And they're investigating kind of like the afterlife and like the eternal and these questions and what it means to die. And Valerie is on the brink of death, like he's confronted with it, and I think that he's more able to cope with that and to navigate that, and I think that he's able to also like sort of escape that in some ways through his ability to kind of like deal with that head on, where I feel like all the other characters in Sopranos world are just like wholly incapable of navigating that world and that realm. Like even actually you mentioned Paulie getting a manicure, like that's the first time we see him. The first scene that we have, there's a great edit actually that I loved. So Paulie's getting a manicure and he's sitting there and there's actually a cut to Tony's feet on the table, and it actually cut straight from Paulie to Tony with his feet on the table. And I feel like that's kind of reflecting like both of them are kind of pampered in some ways and ill-equipped to like deal with real challenges. You know, eventually this leading to like Paulie's lost shoe, but you know, like this kind of like life of relative luxury, and that when they're actually coping with death or you know like a real life or death kind of situation, they're completely unable to deal with it.
No, that's interesting. I think like the death of or like not the death of, I guess, but like the first time where we think that Valerie is dead, right, which is really hard to watch. That's again one of the more like brutal killing scenes that we.
It's pretty violent.
Or not killing, whatever.
Not killing.
It's really hard to watch, but that kind of then sets off this, again, more like surrealist journey that they're taking. Like, up until then, it's pretty much business as usual.
Yeah.
And then there's this thing that really sets off these events that are hyper realistic. And I think definitely like that journey into almost like an underworld in some ways, like it's a place where they're not comfortable. It's a place that is painful. It's a place that like it's really hard for someone to get you out of it, right? Like it's not a place that other people can communicate with you, right? And like I think that goes back to like the static on the phone and stuff like that. Like it's almost like it's like a paranormal activity. Like it kind of made me think of like horror movies when ghosts are trying to call people, you know, like
there was almost it was like a possession or something of the phone. The effects are almost kind of like something you would expect in that kind of
and
genre.
so and that's like, you know, that's kind of the first. It's when Tony goes into the bathroom, right, and he's trying to block the sound from Gloria, and so he's flushing the toilet, but then that's the first time we hear that static happening. So it is like this kind of like ghastly presence there. And then it kind of like that part ends kind of like you mentioned before. That part kind of ends when they're back in the car at the end and they're talking about mayonnaise, you know?
Right.
We don't get it. We don't get like a final phone call or anything like that to kind of wrap it up in a nice bow. Like we'd like, you know, like a super clear phone conversation to hammer home. Like Sopranos doesn't do that for you. They don't try to hit you over the head with these things that they're using or like these symbols that they're using, but you definitely get the sense that like now things are back to the way they were.
Yeah.
Or kind of not. Or characters are changed and they've had this journey.
To a degree, yeah.
I mean, I don't know if characters ever change, but
I feel like the more and more you examine the show, I feel like a central part of it that always kind of comes out is that characters don't change and they always kind of come back to their original
that's
behavior.
Kind of what I was thinking.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I feel like also like the way that they establish Pine Barrens too, like there's such a use of disorienting camera work. And actually, so maybe actually this kind of leads into one of the other things that I think kind of is used within all of the stories is kind of like a lot of movement with the camera.
Yep.
And the use of movement too, like in terms of like the direction of movement for the camera. So within Pine Barrens, there's actually so much kind of like circling camera work that I find is very disorienting, like the movement around these characters where we kind of like get a sense of the landscape, the limitless land that they're surrounded by. There's also like very directional movements, like for example when Tony's talking to them kind of like trying to take care of business and he's on his cell phone and it's like moving in a very straight line very quickly as he walks. There's also like a more kind of purposeful direction, but it's really all over the place. Like Gloria at home when she's making the broil, Meadow in her dorm, you know, when she's kind of like considering what Jackie is. There's really a lot, and I feel like the use of camera and movement and our perspective is really relevant. Even too, like for me, there's something about what I was kind of talking about just very recently about Valerie kind of being the character who's confronted with death. When we first go into Pine Barrens and he's kind of being marched executioner style, we have shots to establish Pine Barrens. They're like establishing shots of the trees. Yeah. And you can see the camera moving and we don't see any characters. And then it's actually somewhat implied that that's actually a POV shot because we see movement kind of looking up at the trees, looking around at the trees, and then we see Valerie. Like it's his face. And his face is actually kind of moving the same way that the shots are moving. And so for me, it's kind of establishing that like that's his perspective and he's seeing those trees. And where there's been such strong relationship between trees and wind and nature, especially when that's all we see in a frame, like when the composition is just nature or often, you know, like greenery or whatever, but in this case it's dead.
There's lots of shots in this episode of like just the forest or just the geese flying or just the like that empty field space. Yeah.
Yeah, and I feel like they're just kind of really focusing on that symbolism, and now they're using it like as a set for an exploration. But I do feel that Valerie is the one who is fully confronted with that.
Yeah.
As time goes on, and there's, time again, it's interesting how it like links these things, but as time goes on, Polly and Christopher are also confronted with their mortality in a very different way.
Yeah.
Where it actually flips. They go from being executioners to being ones who are worried about their own life.
Well, I think that's linked also into the camera work, like you were talking about, this circling. I mean, again, it's like this like slow descent, right? Like they walk in a circle at one point, right? But like we see them kind of coming more and more unhinged as the episode goes on, right?
Totally.
So it's like this like deeper and deeper circling. I love how Polly looks more and more crazy and disheveled, like his hair gets so crazy. We hear Christopher laugh like we've never heard him laugh before, like this like weird crazy laugh. But I think like that is all guiding us towards this very, again, like just talking about the cyclical nature, but also this like spiraling descent into whatever, into death, I guess.
Yeah, totally. And actually it's funny because that moment where Christopher laughs and he's with Polly, he's like literally holding him up. Like he literally has a gun to his face. Like they are actually now, again, like they are threatening the mortality personally. And they are responsible for that. But there's also something there that's maybe the most like emotionally touching scene. And in terms of communication, the scene where they actually communicate the best. Because, that's where they say they won't leave each other. And for me, there's something actually kind of moving about that, and they actually like do care about each other. It takes them holding each other up and being on the brink of killing each other.
Kill each other, yeah.
But like that mental degradation throughout this episode does lead them to that point. And that's actually an interesting thing for me too, because like they're so out of place there, like they don't know how to deal with it. And that's actually, that scene is linked to Tony and Bobby now kind of like at the front, like at the gateway to this domain, where actually there's like that. It's actually like roped off. It's like the end of the road, literally. And then there's, kind of this like gateway into this other region that we deal with in the Pine Barrens. But Tony is also like very uncomfortable in this domain. He's just yelling and honking the horn as much as he can, kind of like asserting himself, but also afraid to cross that divider.
Yeah, well, why do you think they wait until the morning, right? I think like that
I think there's
symbolic.
Like a metaphor. Yeah, I think there's a metaphorical value to that. It's like the river Styx or something, that divide. Like I think, well, what's interesting is that I feel like Tony is afraid of confronting what's beyond there to a certain degree. But what's really interesting in this episode is that Bobby is actually the only one who's comfortable in that domain.
Yeah.
And even the way that he's presented, like it's laughable to Tony and it's like comical in the scene. When he comes out in this hunting attire, but like he's the only one who knows to wear like bright colors to stand out. And when we actually see it visually, it does actually identify him outside of those other characters within that space. And I think that Bobby is now actually getting kind of fleshed out as a character with a different set of characteristics and strengths maybe than the other characters around him. But Tony is clearly uncomfortable in that domain.
He's wearing fancy shoes.
Yeah, and he actually kind of... And they're all wearing, like, leather jackets, and, like, they're just, like, completely out of their element.
Well, I think with Bobby, though, like, I think that kind of makes sense. Like, we have him in this episode, we have him talking about his dad and how he used to go hunting with his dad, right? So he's, like... recently experienced a death of someone who's close to him, and it's impacted him really
That's
greatly.
Right. Yeah.
So he's kind of already like in that world, and then he's also working with Junior, who, although like Junior's not dying actively, he is going through this chemotherapy and this illness, and so I think the fact that that's brought up, like really, and like how good Bobby is kind of at caring for Junior, right? Or Tony's just really grateful. Like Tony's not able to do that. Tony can't really go to that place where he could actually be supportive of Junior and like help him to confront this, like mortality thing, right? Yeah. Like, and so there is something kind of like special about Bobby,
definitely
in that way.
Yeah.
But I do like that he is so decked out in hunting clothes.
Right. Well. and I think I have to bring up the story behind that. There's some. I think it's Steve Sherpa talks about it. I mean, in a couple places, and some of the writing on this episode that you might be reading if you go out and look for it, they reference it. I think he talked to like Entertainment Weekly, but I think also on the Joe Rogan interview he did that you can see on YouTube, amongst other places. He actually talks about what happened in that scene. They said that, he was going to kind of come out and make James Gandolfini laugh. And so he went to the props department and asked for something kind of like completely ridiculous that they had. And he asked for like the biggest possible dildo that they had. And he brought it out and was holding it. And knowing that actually adds a lot to that scene. So he came out and was holding this to like get this reaction out of James Gandolfini. But it's also great to see Dominic Chianesi's reaction to it.
Yeah.
Like the two characters, like James Gandolfini is just losing it.
Yeah.
Like I know it was apparently pretty big. The props department like really hooked it up for this. But also just like Junior looking at him with just like so dead-eyed and unimpressed is pretty great. It's a pretty great scene if you know the story behind it.
He's like almost rolling his eyes like, oh God, you idiot. Yeah.
The acting / like level of knowing what those people as actors were actually thinking is pretty incredible. It's an amazing moment.
Mm-hmm. No, totally. Man, I feel like I'm jumping around a bit, but what do you think? So like we've talked about like nature and things like that, like what nature symbolizes throughout this series. And I think this episode obviously takes place almost completely in nature. So there's something to delve into there. But we also talk about animals, and which are like part of nature, I guess. And we have a really weird part of this episode is when Christopher, by accident, shoots the deer.
Yeah.
I was wondering what you thought about that.
I mean, it's not something that I fully kind of like internalized and thought about it in the moment. But, I mean, if you think about that scene, they're just kind of fully out of control and almost paranoid, kind of like out of the realm of like knowing what's even happening around them. So I mean, like they think that they found him and they go and they start shooting randomly, and while they do that they actually like kill something, and Christopher actually says like if we had been trying to shoot him we never would. Yeah. So I mean I think that it just reflects like how lost they are at that point, and also how kind of destructive these characters are and what the collateral damage is of these kind of like violent behaviors. For me, that's something. Yeah, no, for sure. I feel like there's like something, and again, I can't really put my finger on it, but like there's something about, I don't know, that deer, it's just like such a beautiful deer, and it's like innocent and it's wild, and there's something about the act of them like kind of accidentally shooting it, and maybe it is like you said, like everyone in Soprano world is impacted by their random violence. Like maybe it is just like that, but I don't know. There was something like that scene really hits me when I see it, so I don't know what it is to me. Well, they're also like at that moment they're also kind of like dominating over the natural world. In a way that typically, I mean, they are dominated in this episode, but there's an impact where they are actually like killing this deer, which is interesting to think about because, I mean, if the Pine Barrens, the way that we're kind of trying to look at it right now is largely metaphorical, or on one level is metaphorical, then what's the metaphorical value of killing an animal within that realm? Right. And that's something to think about. Right. For me, it links into like also for some reason in my subconscious or in my brain, I'm linking it to when Gloria throws that piece of meat at Tony. Which there's actually a close-up of, which is a very relevant shot that's used in the show. Like there's very rarely like close-ups of something without stressing importance. Typically it's of somebody's face when something's happening. But there's actually like meat. Yeah, I don't know. There was some kind of, like for some reason that's like connecting in my brain, and that's actually really interesting. I don't know why. Yeah, you could analyze it if you want, but meat. Well, yeah, I mean the role of food in the show is always really interesting and often linked to violence. But and also the lack of food. I mean, actually, food in this episode is also kind of another connector. Yeah, and actually like the meats too, sort of in terms of like what is it, Roy Rogers they want to go to?
Yeah, Roy Rogers.
I forget what the order was.
And then Morton's or something like that for
Morton's
steak.
for the steak.
Yeah.
The steak is actually brought up in multiple places. There's more than just that one reference.
Yeah. I don't know. And then, like, the berries. I don't know. Like, there's definitely stuff about food, but I feel like maybe it's also, too, like, they killed that deer for no reason, right? Like, and they didn't, I mean, like...
Right. They also, like, those characters are incapable of turning that into food.
Right. Yeah.
Like, they are wholly out of their element because they actually hunted and then they just walk away from it.
Yeah.
So it's just destruction.
Yeah.
It's just, like, ceaseless violence.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's just violence.
Yeah. I think, yeah. I mean, I have so many things. I'm trying to structure them.
Yeah, of course. Well, how about, I mean, it's such an interesting episode. For me, like, the form is really fascinating. And it kind of reflects college for me. It's largely a standalone episode. I mean, when you walk away from this episode, and especially when I reflect on it, I'm really left with the Polly Christopher story.
Totally.
But there's a lot of other things happening. And although a lot of the screen time is devoted to Polly Christopher, I don't even know if you could say that it would be the majority of the episode.
I know. You see, yeah, because
by the end, like they really leave you with that.
Yeah, and like you, probably like that's what I remember the most out of this episode. Obviously, like, or not obviously. Maybe for some people, they remember the other stuff.
Yeah, maybe some people are just like Pine Barrens. That's that one with Jackie and Meadow. Or that's the one where Carmela's dad gets glaucoma. Yeah. I've yet to meet that person, but that episode's nuts.
Yeah, that episode's crazy. But yeah, like you're definitely left with that. I think the glaucoma, by the way, is something kind of interesting. It's almost like linked into the communication thing, although like slightly different, right? Like it's not allowing you to see things clearly,
right? And
then the communication thing about not letting you hear things clearly,
right?
Or like speak things clearly.
Yeah.
But yeah. I know we're only like the arc of the story of this episode is really interesting.
Well, yeah, and also that there is kind of this standalone narrative, but then the amazing and for me, like where the hand of the writers is pretty genius level stuff is how you feel like you're in this standalone episode where there's this super captivating short story, but there's just these little snippets, and when you actually step back, you realize, holy shit, they actually propelled the narrative of the season forward a lot.
Yeah.
In this kind of self-contained episode that seemingly has nothing to do with the whole season at large. But it really does. I mean, things actually do propel forward. Yeah. Meadow and Jackie are
now broken up.
I mean, like there was multiple other ones.
Jackie plays Scrabble.
Yeah, so I mean everything's changed now.
but there's
Gloria. I mean, the Gloria and Tony.
Stuff, yeah.
I mean, like actually that's the greatest point of tension that we've had so far.
Yeah.
And I mean, it actually is coming to a boil. And what's fascinating is this is the 11th episode of season 3. Typically, you would think that at this point in the season, a writer's job is fully to kind of like maximize the dramatic potential of the end of the season. And it really doesn't feel like they do that in this episode, except it does. And that's the amazing thing. They have the ambition and the guts to take on an episode that seemingly has nothing to do with the season at large and has something completely unrelated and unnecessary to the end of the season, and yet they still set it up for the end, and they have one of the most captivating stories, and it all fits in, and you have one of the most memorable episodes of all time that also incredibly maximizes its actual like functional purpose of being kind of like
really crazy.
Yeah, at the structural point of the season that requires these kinds of developments.
Yeah. Sorry, just as you were talking, I was just thinking about something, and something kind of became clear to me going back to some of the communication stuff. That Tony in this episode is almost like a conduit of some sort between these two worlds. Like he's the only one that connect, and that's when you talked about college. Actually, that's what kind of made me think of it. Because we have those, like, we have the two storylines, like, you know, Tony and Meadow, and then, like, the Soprano home domain. And Tony's the only one who, like, has any connection of these connects Pine Barrens to the rest of the world, right, through these phone conversations and stuff like that. And so I don't know if that's linked into, like, again, this like newfound honesty that he has, or kind of relates back to, you know, in last episode, we kind of see him as this like satanic kind of creature of some sort. But there's something, you know, just like we were kind of saying, like maybe Bobby is someone who's really comfortable in that domain. Christopher and Polly are not, and Tony is not, but he's able to serve as this kind of like connection point, right? Like he connects basically, I guess, everyone in his life, he connects them to this kind of like underworld. I don't know. At least that's what I like. Yeah. That's kind of how I see that Pine Barrens space as being. I don't see it as like heaven. Yeah. It's not a happy place. No. But Tony's playing this role of like connecting these two worlds.
Yeah, and actually, when you say that it's like it's not like heaven, it's not a happy place, I also don't feel like it's like hell. It's like a place of nothingness, really, which kind of plays into the philosophy of the show at large. Yeah. For me, it's closer to a big nothing or maybe a purgatory than anything else. Yeah. Which is interesting, Polly being there thinking about his pretty simple-minded conceptions of purgatory being a place that he'll go for 6,000 years before he moves on.
He doesn't seem like he's going to last very well.
I don't think he's going to do great there. Yeah. He says he could do it standing on his head in that episode, but I doubt that because he didn't make it a night.
Yeah, he was,
in a forest.
Yeah, he was in the army for 4 years.
Yeah, that experience does not seem to be helping him out particularly well.
But yeah, Tony also says a bunch in this episode, like again, going back to the communication, like, he says it twice in this episode, like, oh, it's the therapy. Like, that's why I'm a better communicator now. Yeah. Or, like, that's why I'm happier or whatever, right? Yeah. So there is something, I mean, therapy, like the kind of therapy Tony's doing is, like, talk therapy, right? Right. So there is something about communicating, and especially because he does it a little more honestly than usual in this episode. There's something about communicating which does kind of like open you up to experience or feel other things that are out there in the world. And so, like, you know, Tony is more open. He is communicating more openly on a whole. He's still obviously like hiding some stuff from people, right? But again, like, kind of, and this is going to sound really like woo or whatever, but like to be able to like access other realms like they kind of do in this episode, right? Like, does require, like, kind of like I was saying about Bobby, like, does require some level of openness, open communication to kind of like understand these really large concepts, like understand concepts of like death and what happens to you and stuff like that. Right. So, I don't know. Yeah. Yeah, actually, interesting. That actually got me thinking too about the way that Carmela communicates in her very small amount of screen time that she has in this episode. Actually, very, very minimal. Yeah, right? Totally. I mean, I can think of 2 scenes really, and both of them are interesting. The first one being in the session with Melfi, where they're talking about how Meadow broke up with Noah Tannenbaum, and Carmela's talking to Tony and saying, "You didn't give her much choice. You didn't give him much choice." Which for me is a fascinating scene because she is now blaming Tony for his racist behavior as the reason that Noah Tannenbaum broke up with Meadow. Except she was assertive enough to confront Meadow in a way in an earlier episode this season where we kind of understand that she doesn't buy that. And now she turns the opposite of that against Meadow, and she also weaponizes it against Tony. Right. So within this season, we've actually seen her take 2 sides of the same argument, which makes, I mean, her beliefs kind of an unknown because she's just kind of taking what's ever convenient for her to win an argument or to kind of get some high ground in an argument. But the communication there is fascinating because it actually directly contradicts something that she was doing very recently. Right. And then the only other thing I can think of is when she's very kind of dictatorial and saying, like, my father has glaucoma. Yeah. You know, like, don't leave, basically. Yeah. But their communication, when you think about how it's talked about in the session with Melfi of saying that our communication is better and that they think it's the therapy, I don't know, is it? They aren't fighting, but it just seems like a matter of time. Like, if they're able to kind of like hold off real arguments and somewhat violent confrontations,
I don't feel like there's anything that they've done that would be responsible for that other than almost luck. Like they haven't been in situations that bring that out of them. And like I don't leave this episode feeling like that isn't coming any more than I would have at any other point. It seems like it's just a matter of time.
Right.
Also actually on that note, the communication between these kind of like dyads of characters again, like not Tony and Carmela, but Meadow and Jackie Jr., when they're playing Scrabble. I mean, it's pretty heavy-handed in a way, but like the disconnect between the words and the language that they're using.
Yeah.
Also, my God, Jackie Jr., not only are you saying the and poo, but as somebody who somewhat enjoys playing the game of Scrabble, to use 2 S's on ass. My God, that just pains me. S's, man. You can't play an S and not get like
a lot of points.
You gotta get like 30. You gotta get like 40 points if you're gonna use an S.
Yeah.
35, 40 points minimum, man.
He could have played
2 of them?
Obliques.
God fucking damn it. That is just really painful to see.
Yeah.
He had 2 S's.
Yeah.
Should be getting 7-letter word bonus for sure.
Yeah. No, I agree. But yeah, no, it does. So, and he says he's not a music
English major.
He's not an English major. Which is, really comical. But he's also, like, again, with that kind of, like, openness of communication or not, he's lying to Meadow about all sorts of things.
Yeah.
He hasn't told Meadow yet that he's not a student anymore. She's like, you're a university student.
Yeah.
And he's like, I'm not an English major, right?
Right.
Jackie
Jr. is not representing very well right now.
No, he's a piece of shit.
He sucks. Better than Noah? Ooh.
Yeah.
Your estimation is lowered. That was a slam dunk for you last time.
I know. He's pretty shitty in this episode. He lies to her about his mom's car, like all this kind of stuff, right? And Meadow has the sense to kind of think it's bullshit, right? Like, I don't know what clues her in necessarily. I think it's looking at the Scrabble board and seeing, like, this guy's...
The poo ass.
The poo ass, yeah. But then she goes and, goes with her friend who has a sweet car.
Damn.
Her friend has this, like, I don't even know. I don't know cars.
I didn't even pick up on that.
It's like a 2-seater race car kind of thing. Like I don't even know. I could say a car.
She also, that character also calls Jackie Jr. a drip.
Yeah, he's a total drip.
That's a total drip.
Yeah. What else? And they say that Meadow's better off, and that he's cute but boring. But Meadow's like really perplexed by that too, right? Because
she also comes off as pretty childlike. Like her maturity seems very lacking at that moment.
Yeah. Well, she's sick, right?
Yeah.
And like that's the thing too. Like she's physically also not well, and that's like that does kind of bring out childish impulses or whatever. But she's like one of the her big thing is like you just don't know what it's like growing up where we did.
Yeah.
And so like she's not just losing that relationship, which was pretty shitty, but she's losing this like someone who understands where she comes from and who she is.
Yeah.
And again, like when they communicate about things, they know what each other are talking about, right?
Yeah.
If they can like refer to things in their own life, they know each other are talking about.
Right.
Other people don't get that, and so that's a huge loss.
You don't know what it was like.
Yeah.
You grew up in Jersey.
Yeah.
Yeah. Nobody knows.
Nobody does know. The one thing I also wanted to go back to in terms of being in Pine Barrens was, and again, linked into that surrealist kind of setting that we have, when they find each other, right? So when Tony and Bobby find Chris and Polly, it's with this like series of gunshots, which is very hard to track, like, like the sound of a gunshot. So they were all like, for some reason, very capable of doing that. And then they like run right towards each other, right? Like it's so illogical. Since they've been walking around in circles, like the fact that they could run directly at each other like that, I think is again like the writers and the director and David Chase playing with us so much. Like that's just like totally impossible, right? Because then you have later too. Who was it? Who was it that said? I think it's Bobby that says anything's possible, right? And I forget what prompt.
He says, okay, so he says flesh wound, maybe. Like in terms of like, could he get out of this? Tony says, what do you think? Could he get out of the woods? And he says, flesh wound, maybe. Headshot, I don't know. On the other hand, anything is possible.
Yeah.
Which is really reminiscent of the statements about backs. You know, when it comes to backs, nobody knows.
Yeah.
And for me, that introduces that aspect of ambiguity that's so central to the show. And what Valerie represents is really interesting because we will never have closure to does he get away or not.
No, I know. And it's so...
And that's so difficult for people to deal with. And in fact, in the context of this episode, that's like been such a huge thing for people who watch the show. Everybody wanted to know, did he escape?
Yeah.
And I think that's so not the point of this. Like, it's so not...
But I love how they give you little things that could like, and that's, again, the point of this show, I think, is to kind of like give you hints on both sides and let you kind of decide what you think, right? So like the fact that Polly's car is missing at the end, right?
Yeah.
You know, the fact that the blood trail ends, right?
Yeah.
Like that there's no blood trail.
But
that
for me,
follows.
it's like a false path that you're tracking or something. Like,
Yeah.
It's like a little puzzle, but it leads nowhere. And that's the point.
Yeah. No,
It's supposed to play with us, and it's supposed to play with that human aspect of wanting to have closure. And it reflects how all these characters want to have closure. But this show revels in, and David Chase revels in, that lack of answer.
Yeah, well, and Polly makes a choice too, right? Like Tony leaves it up to Polly. Like, do you want to go and find this guy or not? Yeah. Polly comes to the decision that
fuck it.
He's you know, like Polly's comfortable. I wouldn't say he's like confident, but Polly's at least comfortable thinking that he's dead.
I think he just needs to get out of there.
Probably, yeah. He's done probably the worst out of everyone in that scenario. I mean, like losing his shoe and making himself this carpet shoe, and then getting that carpet shoe stuck and having to shoot his carpet shoe.
Yeah.
You know, he's like the most deranged. Chris is pretty deranged too, but I don't know. Polly just always is deranged, so it's like an extra level.
Totally. Totally, yeah.
But it's interesting, like, that's where he settles, right? And, like, Tony's face is kind of interesting, too. It's ambiguous in some ways, too, but we don't know what Tony feels or thinks about that. We don't get closure on that either.
No. Which is interesting, actually, that Tony lets Polly decide something, because that is rare in the context of this show. Yeah. For him, like, his leadership style doesn't tend to be to hand off to others and let them decide things. Mm-hmm. He tends to be pretty impulsive and strong with those kinds of things. So that's interesting. I feel like, like this show is amazing because as you watch it, they kind of start to give other characters the ability to engage in decision making that typically was only reserved for Tony in the beginning. Right. And it's like a deeper and deeper window into who these people are. And that's part of what differentiates the show from everything else, because the full ensemble is fully realized. I mean, all characters get this kind of psychological profiling that unfolds throughout all the seasons. Yeah. No, and that's, I think, like, some characters we get sooner than others, right? Mm-hmm. Like, it's, but I think this episode definitely in terms of Chris and Polly, and maybe Polly even more so than Christopher in some ways. Like, we get this insight into how they react in these stressful situations and who they are in relation to each other, and how that, you know, like when Christopher is like threatening to kill Polly, that's pretty intense, right? Yeah. Like Polly's supposed to be his like mentor or whatever. Yeah. Like I don't know what he would call himself. It's pretty intense. But it's pretty intense, and they somehow come out on the other side of that too. And they almost come out on the other side for the first time actually being like fully connected. Well, totally, and they're on the same page, right? So that's part of that whole discussion. Like when Tony's like asking them what happened, and looks to Christopher to kind of like confirm or deny Polly's story, he goes along with what Polly was saying, right? It's like kind of somewhere in the middle. Yeah, it's not Polly selling him out, right? Yeah. But it's also not Polly telling the whole story. Right. It turned into he lunged at us. Right. So, yeah. Which I guess is true after you get into the whole Polly dropping his remote. His universal remote. Being huge. dicks and attacking him.
Yeah.
Okay, how about what else do you have? I have some kind of stray things that are coming up, but before I kind of get into those, I think there's more to kind of talk about with Gloria as a character and the developments that happened to her in this episode. First off, one thing that I thought was like so fascinating is the art behind Tony and Gloria.
We both noticed that.
Yeah, so
when they're in, I guess, her bedroom.
Yeah, or some bedroom.
Or
Who
some
knows
bedroom.
Where they are?
Yeah.
But art is always used in this show to kind of reflect who characters are, and that's kind of a window into what's going on underneath the surface with different people. The fascinating thing about this, and this is really something, is that the artwork above Tony and the artwork above Gloria are the same piece, and it's actually just an inverse depiction of the other painting. So it's almost this like kind of like yin and yang sort of painting kind of thing that we have going on there, and it's this kind of like shape based.
Yeah, there's like circles and lines.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the connection between them is definitely something that is reflected in the artwork. And I feel like those two characters reflect certain key characteristics of each other. And that's something that we talked about earlier, in terms of Tony seeking out a character who actually is something that he's actually been very comfortable with because it reflects his own mother.
Yeah.
Which is something that Melfi brings up and closes out the episode with.
Well, and reflects himself too. Like Tony's obviously like it's not like he is the opposite of his mother.
Yeah.
You know, like he has these characteristics that have been given to him from her or by her or whatever. But he's not the same. It's the way it comes out in him is not the same as it does. But like that kind of maybe like the underlying shapes and lines are the same. It's just like kind of flipped on its end.
Yeah.
You know, it is this like the big nothing and you know, that nihilism kind of thing that she has. Like he definitely has that too. It just comes out in kind of a different way.
Okay, this actually brings up a question that I wanted to pose to you.
Yes.
So, in a lot of the analysis of Gloria,
yes,
she's overwhelmingly talked about as this kind of nihilistic, destructive, majorly depressed person who is kind of like carnage to Tony's life and to everybody around her and to herself. Now, my question is, when I was watching this, is that, and maybe I'm just playing devil's advocate, but is that fully fair? Because when you examine what happens to Gloria in this episode, she's makes plans with Tony that are fully realized.
Yep.
He comes 3 hours late.
Yeah.
And
she's
then
mad.
She actually kind of makes up for it, and she has every right to be mad. But then when he just leaves again without saying anything, is it really fair to say that she's a destructive personality based on the way that she reacts to that? I mean, in some ways it's actually, she's the person who is actually the most like willing to take Tony on for bullshit and in control of a situation, not afraid of her own shadow, and actually like willing to confront people, and in some ways dealing with the situation in a kind of like I mean, it's not adult to throw the thing out the window and to throw a meat chop at somebody's head.
Yeah,
but in some ways,
all your everything on the table.
I guess not. That is something.
No, but I think you're kind of onto something in some ways. Like, like kind of like was she better off before meeting Tony? Right? Like, has therapy been helpful for her up until this point, where now she's kind of like descending back into her, you know, negative behaviors or something like that.
Well, yeah.
I think there's something like we see this shot of the back of her head.
You do, and actually with the like a brooch, like the diamond kind of. Is that what it is?
It's a Brett.
A Brett.
Barrette.
Oh, a barrette.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's a lot more talk about how she's a destructive influence on Tony than vice versa, and I actually don't think that's fair.
No, you're right. I think they're like kind of like the pictures indicate.
They're mutually
destructive.
Both
like there's something about the two of them, and then the two of them together that is like just. It would be worse than if either of them were with someone else.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? Like it's like I don't know what the right word to look for is, but like it's like compounded.
It's like mutually assured destruction.
Yeah.
Mad.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, at the same time, like that assertive quality that she has, I'm not sure if that is, perhaps that's like a positive attribute, and I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, she definitely like calls him out on his shit.
Yeah, which I think in that situation is not unfair.
No. I mean, Carmela wouldn't, right? Like, Carmela said, like, my dad has glaucoma, and then he still left anyways.
Right. He stayed for a bit. We don't know how long. 3 hours, I guess. Actually, he stayed for 3 hours.
Well, we don't know if he was already late for dinner. It seemed like he was already late.
We saw the time. Dinner. You could see the time there.
Shoot.
Actually, yeah, there's a clock.
Shoot.
It seemed like when he was leaving, I mean, the problem is you don't know how long it would take him to get to Gloria's house.
Right.
Depending on that, he was either on time or not.
Right.
But I actually got the feeling that he was on time because, I mean, you can see the clock. We don't know how far it is, so we have a variable or whatever missing. But he's kind of like on his way out. He's leaving.
Yeah.
And so I get the impression that he was leaving at the time that was necessary to do all those different things.
Yeah, I didn't even think about that.
Yeah.
But yeah, like, again, that is kind of one of those ways in which they play with the passage of time for you. Like, it's ambiguous. You actually
and it's so literal. Like, actually, we can actually, like, code together the timeline of what happens that night to the point that we know, like, okay, Carmela said this, and then he must have been there for 3 hours.
Yeah, kind of. I don't know. I don't know. He still
Unless he, like, went to the Bing or something.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't remember what time it said when he was sitting down to dinner.
It was
on the clock.
I didn't, like, write it down.
Yeah.
It looks like, I think it was, like, to me, it looked like it was, like, 25 to 9 or something.
Right.
Kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah. Which is probably about how long it would take him to get there.
I don't know.
Glorious.
I feel like Gloria lives far away. I don't know.
Now we're really stretching. We really have no basis for knowing how far
idea.
Gloria lives.
No, but like that's the thing. Like there is like I feel like that's purposely kind of ambiguous in some ways. If it's making us kind of like be weird about it, then there must be something weirdly ambiguous about it. He seemed like he was in a rush even when they were sitting down to dinner, to me.
Right.
But there's also a great shot of the moon, which I like as a time indicator.
I like that.
Yeah, there's like characters mentioning the time a lot. I don't know, there's so many great things there. But time is a concept that we've created as humans too, right?
Yeah.
Like time is really meaningless, except when I think you're out. And it's funny, like they're out in the woods, right? Where like in nature, time is kind of just governed by night and day, right? Kind of like I was going back to what I mentioned at the beginning of our episode. Like that's what governs time, but yet Polly and Christopher are still also governed by, like they're looking at their phone that has a massive amount of battery life at their phone to see what time it is, and like
those early 2000 phones did pretty well.
I don't remember that. It was like a
I think they actually,
it was like a Nokia
incredible
model. Yeah.
I guess nobody was wasting all their phone battery.
Right. You just used it when you had to call someone.
Listening to podcasts and playing
games.
Temple Run.
Candy Crush. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know.
There's also like Gloria giving him that present of the
kaftan.
Kaftan. I was going to call it a kurta. Kaftan?
Maybe,
is that what it is?
Maybe it is.
No, I don't think it is a kurta.
I don't think
that's
it's a
different.
kaftan either, though.
Oh, God.
Well,
somewhere in between a kurta and a kaftan.
Robe with a hood.
Roby hood. When she gives him Roby hood.
Yeah.
Also something that actually separates that domain of the relationship between Tony and Gloria and what that is.
Yeah.
Because seeing Tony in that is like so different than any way we've ever seen Tony represented.
Yeah.
And the fact that he takes it off and then goes to the woods and then engages in that kind of behavior and engages with those characters is obviously separated from that. And there's like a visual aspect to seeing him there with Gloria wearing that thing.
Yeah.
That is different.
Well, it's an interesting scene too, or group of scenes, I guess, because we have him like arrive at Gloria's and she's mad and we see the back of her head and then they're like snuggling on the couch.
Yeah.
And in the meantime, they have sex. We don't see them do that. But then after, when we see them again, Tony's wearing this hood robe.
Yeah, robe hood.
Robe hood. and she's been like re-preparing a dinner.
Right.
In the meantime too, right? So I just found like that was, and then she's like obviously pissed because she's like made one dinner and now she's like remaking another one, and then he takes off his robe hood and goes, you know?
Yeah, totally. A few things too. I mean, now I'm into kind of my stray asides, but like between the communication between them, like that first scene when they come, like it's interesting to see the way that those two are communicating. I mean, she picks up the phone, she talks, which is weird. He comes in, they're talking. How was Morocco? Great.
Right.
That's it. It's like this kind of...
Well, she's mad. Of course she would say
She's mad.
that.
But then, you know, it's turning into these other things. Like, we obviously are seeing cracks already in their relationship, and their style of communication is definitely problematic.
Yeah. What does the card that she gives him say? Shoot, I meant to write it down.
I'm feeling sheepish.
I'm feeling sheepish. Yeah, that was funny.
I didn't know that card existed.
It's a good card.
I've never seen it. Yeah.
What do you think? So, like, the van that they hide out in, it's a plumbing van.
Yeah.
I couldn't read the whole title on it. What do you think?
Why is the van a plumbing van?
Well, what does it mean? Why is there a plumbing van out in the woods?
Dear listeners, please let us know why you think that there's a plumbing van in the woods. I've come up with my theories up to this point, but we need your help on the plumbing van.
Yeah, that's a key, obviously, to this episode.
Yeah.
No, it's not. I don't think. Maybe it is. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe you guys know. You guys hold the key.
What else?
Tony's assessment of woman, again, getting to kind of his communication and his maybe like in his kind of like inner feelings when he says to Melfi, you know, she's smart, sexy, Italian. She has great legs, which is kind of a bit of a reiteration of the second, but that's okay. But like that,
you can have great legs and not be sexy.
I guess so, but he's expanding. He's expanding on the second.
Yeah.
The fact that he got to say 4 things and 2 of them are sexy and great legs is...
Well, I thought that was interesting, like, because Tony has been attracted to Melfi before, right?
Well, and
like,
still kind of is, because he's still kind of flirtatious with her.
And so what is, like, how is Melfi related to Gloria, Irina, and then by extension, Tony's mother? You know, like, I think, like, that there is some kind of connection for Tony there.
Right.
Even though he kind of backtracks later, he's like, actually, you're not really like her at all. But, like, there is something, like, Tony is attracted to her. And, like, the people that Tony's attracted to do share things in common. So I thought that was interesting
Yeah.
And I don't know what kind of to make of it, but I want to pay attention to it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting though too for me, like what he sees in Gloria. Like, I mean, that's, pretty like ultra simplistic too. I mean, I guess he's not in a situation where he needs to be like fully kind of realizing like what the connection is, but there's actually, like Italian, and actually not. It makes you question kind of what that relationship is, and in some ways, I guess it is largely a sexual relationship. But it does kind of come across to me as like not fully fleshed out, or he hasn't fully confronted kind of like what the relationship is to him, or like what he sees in it, or what it means. It's just kind of like action, and kind of like immediate draw. What else? Chris and Polly talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Chris didn't know that the Cuban Missile Crisis was real. I thought that it was bullshit.
Yeah, it was in a movie.
Yeah. What is it? Who cares? But
these are the most important parts of the episode.
It's fine. But for me, that did like represent a generational divide, and also like a pretty glaring lack of knowledge on Christopher's part, and what Christopher and Polly both represent in terms of like where they're from, but like Christopher's inability to kind of like know very, very basic history that like immediately preceded his life is interesting.
Yeah, totally.
And I feel like for me, there was something connected from that to like these characters being unable to navigate the world that they're finding themselves in, and the new time that they're in, and the new century, and it's like inability to interact through technology, where they're just kind of out of their element, and they're just kind of have such a narrow focus, and maybe that's it's just kind of very, very narrow. One shot I liked where Tony goes to meet Slava, and we can actually see 3 things that are very kind of clear in the kind of composition of the frame, where you have like
the gun,
Slava, Tony, and the gun on the table exactly, and he's saying he could be walking into a buzzsaw or whatever he says, but there's that kind of like foreboding sense, and like we're kind of on alert, but it's a great shot. Just
it
the
really
way that
draws
they kind
your
of compose
eyes to it.
And it communicates so much without saying anything.
Yeah.
And it actually plays on us to piece it together, and it's actually incorrect. He's fine.
Yeah, well, and we actually get kind of the opposite of what Tony expects. We get Slava like having a very emotional moment, right? Like he's actually crying in front of Tony, which I don't think Tony, like, I wouldn't imagine Tony would be a guy who's, like, great at dealing with crying, but he actually handles it pretty well.
Who knew?
I know. What a sensitive dude.
Well, Pine Barrens is one of the great Sopranos episodes, and it's a pleasure to talk about it.
Yes.
It's a lot of fun, and
there's definitely, like, I don't know, I feel like I need to, like, sleep on it. Maybe do part 2 another time. Actually, if I have my thoughts,
Yeah, of course.
But
as always, I mean,
I think these are just like things, I don't know, things that stand out and things that hold meaning, even if I can't quite yet figure out what that meaning is.
And let us know your thoughts. Just today, somebody emailed us with some of their thoughts, and we loved it. It made us very happy. So
yeah, because we could sit here our whole married lives and talk about what we think, but and we know that there's different interpretations of all these things. And actually, I mean, for myself too, like, just thinking about, like, coming up with these theories, like, they really are nothing more than that at a lot of levels for me. Like, I think that what's put out there is supposed to be interpreted many different ways, and we're super interested in what other people think and how they piece it together. I think that's, like, the point. I love, it's cool.
Yeah. So thank you for listening.
Yeah.
And we'd love to hear from you, and we'll see you next time. We're getting near the end of season 3.
We're getting to penultimate.
Wow.
Okay.
See you then.
Bye.
Bye.